What's going on, guys? Hope this video finds you well. So Shin Megami Tensei V was a game that I initially skipped out on at its initial release in 2021 for a few reasons. Primarily that I wasn't particularly interested in mainline SMT at the time, but also there was somewhat of a mixed reception when it came to certain aspects of the game, and SMT V being included in that infamous NVIDIA leak. All of these factors contributing towards my decision to wait for an inevitable PC port of this game. I do think most of the new content is fairly obvious because of, for one, the marketing, and for two, I looked into some of these things on my own out of curiosity. So I feel like I'm knowledgeable about what has been added and changed in this release, despite not having direct experience with the canon of creation. And even though I want this video to be as comprehensive as possible, the core point that I want to focus on is Shin Megami Tensei V's role as a potential turning point in the mainline series. I played the entirety of the game on hard mode. It took me around 90 hours to finish, while being extremely thorough in not only my exploration and completion of subquests, but also in filling out the compendium. I'm only missing some of the really high level special fusions that I didn't really feel like grinding out. And speaking of grinding, I did kind of get suckered into paying the extra $10 for the day one DLC. While I did deactivate the Mitama DLCs, I think it'll be nice having those for post-game and even new game plus grinding as far as completion is concerned. Although the main draw for this DLC was the 2 bonus subquests, and while it is nice to have access to those extra demons that you can recruit from said subquests, I don't particularly think they are worth $10 on their own, especially considering just how many subquests are in the Vengeance package. For those of you who are able and interested in showing additional support towards me in the channel, since this is a one-man operation, I do have a Ko-fi page for direct donations as well as the myriad ways to show support through YouTube. This of course includes channel memberships, which are something I'm always looking to add value to if you have any feedback on that. Thank you to those who have shown support thus far, and thank you to everyone else for your consideration. First and foremost, let's talk about the presentation. Finally, there is a new fully 3D Shin Megami Tensei game after damn near 20 years since SMT Nocturne. Kinda crazy that it took so long for the mainline series to get back to home consoles, maybe even crazier that this is the first fully HD entry as well, considering how long games have been developed in HD for. So that alone is a huge difference. And for the people in the back, it is not so much about the graphics specifically. That's the thing that really annoys me when it comes to this kind of conversation. No, it's more so about the animations and the capability for expressions from the characters. And you can definitely convey some of that through pixel art in varying degrees, whether it be the Final Fantasy VI approach or how Atlus tends to handle things with character portraits. And sure, you try to make the most with what you've got as far as the hardware the game is being developed for, but those character portraits in a lot of Atlus games are to make up for the fact that the sprites or character models weren't really made to be expressive in the same way as you see in their more modern titles. And while I do tend to want to steer the conversation away from graphics specifically, I think there is something to be said at least every once in a while for playing a game that is striking visually and is able to convey detailed 3D environments and characters that you can get lost in. Despite playing this game at a higher resolution and frame rate than the Switch is capable of, I think you can still kind of tell that it was developed for a less powerful system and has been upscaled to some degree for more powerful systems. But that's not really something that bothered me particularly. It's just one aspect of many that have me looking forward to the next mainline entry, assuming that'll be developed for all platforms at once, as Atlus is doing nowadays. I do have a point that did somewhat bother me at times, and that is the occasional lack of aesthetic cohesion, both visually and musically. The main culprit of this is what I view as somewhat of a clash between the visual design of environments and characters from the base game versus the visual design of the new environments and characters in Vengeance. I was much more interested in the new stuff, both aesthetically and even thematically, than I was the components that were clearly there to begin with. I think the emphasis of that red color that is very associated with the Kadistu, it almost feels like that color palette or that overall aesthetic could be used to make its own game, as opposed to as it is now, where it kind of feels like it's been grafted onto something that already existed. The soundtrack this time around was done primarily by Ryota Kozuka with some help from Toshiki Konishi, and I just feel like there's some Konishi tracks that don't quite blend with Kozuka's style for this particular game. There are at least a handful of Konishi tracks that this point doesn't apply to and that I do enjoy listening to, but there are others where I feel like it kind of clashes with the bulk of the rest of the game's soundtrack. Now moving on to some story talk, I'm going to keep this as spoiler-free as possible, and then talk about spoilers specifically later on. I feel like the overall tone of this game is pretty stoic, and at times feels so stoic to the point of being bland. I think that's my biggest issue when it comes to my comment about aesthetic cohesion earlier, where the new stuff felt very distinct. It had a very strong sense of identity, like I feel from some of the earlier mainline titles I talked about on the channel. But again, as much as I was interested in the new stuff visually and thematically, I still couldn't shake this this feeling of it being grafted onto the pre-existing blandness. This primarily applies to the characters, especially the ones that I know were present in the base game. I didn't feel like they were particularly memorable in the grand scheme of things. Whereas whenever the Kiristu in particular were on screen, I felt much more engaged in what was happening and what could happen at any moment because of how compelling I thought they were as an antagonistic group early on. Though after a certain point I thought they felt underutilized, and this is not to say that I disliked everything about the narrative aspects that were present in the base game, but it isn't something that really grabbed me when the game was initially being shown off. I think in particular, it was the focus on the school setting. This is something I've been kind of ruminating on recently. I understand how significant high school is to Japanese culture and why it is used so heavily in their media, but looking at this as an American, since I only have my experiences to judge things based off of, obviously, I think a big reason why I don't mind the high school setting in Persona 3 and 4, to an extent 5, is because those games roughly take place around the time that I was still in school. Persona 3 takes place in 2009. I wasn't quite in high school yet, but that is an era that I grew up during. And same with Persona 4, where that game takes place in 2012, I want to say, which I was actually in high school at that time. And when it comes to Persona 5, while I don't think that there's a confirmed year that the game takes place, I would hazard a guess and say that it's somewhere between, I don't know, 2015 and 2018 or something like that. And so while I was in college during that span of time, it wasn't that far removed from high school. And even then, I feel like that particular high school culture that is present in P5 did kind of get on my nerves at times. And I would say that while the actual school stuff in Shin Megami Tensei V is not largely relevant to the game as a whole, it's kind of that vibe of a current day high school setting with characters that are written to be more like current day high schoolers that I think fails to resonate with me as much. While, as far as I understand, some of these characters were fleshed out a little bit more in Vengeance compared to the original release, I wouldn't really consider most of them to be highlights from this game, nor would I necessarily include most of them in a list of my favorite Megami Tensei characters or anything like that either, with I guess the closest thing to an exception being the alignment reps for the Vengeance route. I guess light spoilers for SMT5 as far as who the alignment reps are. If you don't want to know, just skip to the next timestamp. I knew that Yuzuru and Ichiro were the alignment reps for the base game, and they remain so for the Canon of Creation. I kind of assumed going into this that that would be the same case for Vengeance, just with some tweaks, but actually the alignment reps ended up being Tao and the newly added character Yoko, and I quite liked these two as alignment reps. I think them physically being in your party was something that factored into a potential bond that you could have with these characters, as opposed to them kind of spontaneously appearing, or even just being interactable in story sequences or whatever. So I really liked that aspect, and I'm assuming that's the case to some extent in Canon of Creation. I'm very curious to check that out. But you add to this that Tao and Yoko pretty much always have something to say at the end of the various subquests throughout Shin Megami Tensei V, and I really like how those interactions also work to develop their characters. I don't exactly know how this would work if you skipped out on early game subquests and then went back to go do them with them in your party. I can't imagine it would be different depending on certain stages in the game, but it at least makes sense if you're kind of doing these subquests as you progress. Tao starts off as a very meek person, whereas Yoko has much more conviction than her. So oftentimes Yoko would state her opinion on the matter. Tao would maybe start to push back, but then because of Tao's more meek nature, it would often feel like Yoko would win whatever argument or disagreement was being had, with Yoko's perspective tending to be a little more on the nihilistic side, whereas Tao tended to be more hopeful. As you progress throughout the game, or as you do later game subquests with these two in your party, you get a sense of these characters developing throughout the journey, where Tao starts to push back against Yoko a little bit more, and Yoko at times would even back off a little bit. I would go so far as to say there were times where it felt like there was some kind of mutual understanding, or at least them being able to agree to disagree, as opposed to the earlier game where Yoko would kind of stonewall Tao's perspective to the point where Tao would back down. And I like that dynamic. It is similar to what I said about the Kiristu, something that I think sort of starts to fall by the wayside in the later game, but I did overall enjoy them as alignment reps and as actual party members that aren't just your demons. I guess I'll save the rest for the more spoilery section later on, but when it comes to my spoiler-free impressions of the story as a whole, this game's story sort of feels like the bare minimum for a JRPG, which may or may not be praiseworthy in its own right given how half-baked the original narrative supposedly was, but in my opinion it's still not anything spectacular, primarily because of the extreme stoicism present in the overall tone. While I do tend to prefer stories in games that take themselves seriously, even if they may be ridiculous, I feel like this game weirdly tries to be more grounded than it should be or something. It's really hard for me to pinpoint specifically what it is, but if you've played the game, you probably know what I mean. Now this leads me into the exploration side of the game. Instead of having an overworld map with dungeons connecting various points on said map, Shin Megami Tensei V pivots towards what I would deem a more exploratory, almost sandbox-like structure. So the game consists of much more open areas areas than your typical dungeon, with the traditional world map only being present when you return to the surface world periodically for story reasons. These areas are largely wide and open, but there are built-in choke points to kind of rein you in to certain story beats. So it's not open to the extent of an open world by any means, but it feels open enough with enough points of interest to make exploration really satisfying and rewarding. I never felt that I absolutely needed to clear out every single point of interest, but I did so anyway because not only was it a satisfying process to explore these areas, but also because anything and everything that you can find in this game contributes to building yourself for combat, which of course is a major focal point for mainline Shin Megami Tensei. Part of what makes these areas so fun to explore intrinsically, as in not really concerning the rewards that you're finding, but more so the fun of exploration itself, is because of just simply the act of moving around in this world and the newly added platforming to the series, which I thought could be quite fun at times, especially when accessing areas that felt like you were going out of bounds, like jumping off of various cliffs to access lower areas and whatnot. It was just a fun process to figure out how to get to certain places and then executing on that. My smallest of gripes when it comes to the platforming, though, is that there seems to be little to no momentum in movement and jumping, nor does there appear to be any jump height variance depending on how long you press the button. These are things that aren't absolutely necessary because this game is not a 3D platformer in that way, but these are some things that I would like to see sort of fleshed out in an inevitable Shin Megami Tensei 6. And on top of moving around on foot, you also have the newly added Magatsu rails, which primarily act as shortcuts for getting to some of the more out of reach locations. And a lot of these do convene at leyline founts, which kind of act as your major checkpoints where you can heal, fuse demons, buy items, save, etc. Now, something that was added to this Vengeance release was the ability to save anywhere at any time. Now, in a game that is more linear and structured and focused on kind of the survival aspect of getting from checkpoint to checkpoint, I think the ability to save anywhere can trivialize such an experience, which is how I felt about Shin Megami Tensei IV, especially because there is no other method of saving there. However, in SMT V, not only is there a method of saving at these various leyline founts, so you could opt to not save anywhere if you don't want to participate in that system. Would be even better maybe if you could opt to turn off the ability to save anywhere in the options or something to that effect, but I don't really see it as a huge deal, primarily because even in the base game, there was this item called the Return Pillar, which could literally warp you instantly at any time to the last leyline fount you used. So allowing you to save anywhere is just kind of functionally the same as using the Return Pillar and saving at said leyline fount. This game doesn't have the same feel as a Nocturne or a Strange Journey, for instance, where a notable factor in those games' gameplay loops is dungeon crawling and therefore trying to push towards the next save point or feeling like you should double back to your previous save point if you feel like you're far off from the next one. And that's why I actually think that the ability to save anywhere in the few dungeons that are present in SMT V does hurt those segments specifically. This in part does lead to the actual dungeons, funny enough, being my least favorite part of this game. The dungeons that were added in felt sort of like the devs were thinking, oh no, our mainline SMT game doesn't have dungeons, better just add some for the sake of adding some. And that's not to say the dungeons are bad necessarily, but I just don't think that the general design of SMT V lends itself to dungeon crawling in the traditional sense. Now, in a hypothetical SMT 6, instead of the somewhat empty overworld segments that you have in the earlier titles, where all you can really encounter is random encounters and maybe some treasure chests here and there, maybe you kind of consider those segments to be more like the open areas in 5, scatter more traditional dungeons throughout, but design them in a way and limit the player in a way to feel like more of a distinct shift compared to the way that the dungeons are designed in SMT V specifically. And I think this checks out too because I enjoyed the school dungeon more than the dungeons that were later on in the game, and I think it's partially because the gimmicks and puzzle solving in the later dungeons feeling sort of tacked on. In fact, there are good chunks of, especially the last dungeon, where I don't even think you have to participate in the gimmick to progress, which I thought was an odd choice. Shit, you could even pivot the dungeons in an SMT6 to being random encounters, and almost sort of like the Labyrinth of Amala where maybe you can't recruit demons in there, putting some kind of limitations on the player to emphasize the dungeon crawling, whereas in the more open sandbox areas, it could be more like 5, where it's less about that survivalist aspect and more about gathering the tools necessary to tackle these hypothetical dungeons. And I guess that leads me to the extrinsic motivation present in the exploration in SMT V generally, being that literally every single point of interest in this game gives you something that helps build either your main character or your party, which you definitely want to make use of, whether it be the Memon, which allow you to purchase miracles, which are basically like purchasing apps in Strange Journey or 4, with the caveat being not all of these miracles are available to you at once. You kind of unlock them in chunks as you defeat abscesses that are scattered around the maps. And so this prevents you from just maxing out your skill slots or maxing out the stock limit right away. You kind of have no choice but to work within some of those limitations early on, which I think is a very good thing, but it's still flexible enough to where you can choose what to invest in. And of course you can find the Aogami essences scattered about. Essences more or less work like sources from Strange Journey, except you don't need to fuse to use them. You can just straight up apply any of the skills from said essences to your demons or your main character. And for your main character, you can even use these essences to change your resistances and weaknesses and whatnot, which is something that you also had to compromise on early on until you gain access to skills that can nullify some of the weaknesses present on even the more powerful essences. Of course, there are item caches scattered about, and despite there being inventory limits on certain items, I was not often unable to pick up any item from these caches because I was actually regularly using many of the items present. And of course, there's others. There's like the statues that give your demons big chunks of EXP. You can even kind of consider the demons that are scattered about as being points of interest in their own way, as not only a conduit to gain EXP and level up, but primarily for recruitment and fusion purposes, which is much more important in SMT. I spent a very minimal amount of game time grinding levels in the traditional sense, and more often than not gained the bulk of my EXP from doing the subquests, which for the most part all felt pretty meaningful in some form or another. They are mostly combat or fetch quest oriented. The way in which they felt meaningful were not only in their rewards, but also from bits of lore that were given on the various demons that you are interacting with, and even some alignment oriented decisions, all of which kept what otherwise would be fairly mundane subquests interesting and worth doing. I think I did literally every subquest that was available to me in this route, except for fighting the Demi-Fiend specifically, which I'll definitely go out of my way to attempt on a following playthrough. There were definitely times where I was focusing on subquests, and so it felt like I wasn't making as much progress, but that is something that was self-inflicted. One point of criticism specific to the Vengeance route was that I felt that some of these subquests could have been spaced out a little bit more, particularly in the third area. I seem to recall Shinjuku being pretty limited at first, but then after a certain point it gave you access to areas that you weren't necessarily supposed to go to for story reasons until later. I do appreciate that level of freedom, but because I was so meticulous in my exploration, by the time it was time to go there for story reasons, I just kind of popped into the story thing and then instantly went to the next area because it was already clear. That's not really anything major as far as criticism is concerned. I think it's safe to say this is probably the most robust and refined combat system in mainline SMT, and maybe Megami Tensei, just generally speaking. There were some pretty significant changes that were made here, probably the most major of which being how buffs function, where in previous games you could stack buffs up to 3 or 4 times depending on what game you're playing. These buffs would remain for the entirety of the fight, assuming that the enemy didn't debuff you or use Dekaja to wipe away your buffs. And similarly, any debuffs applied to you in previous games would remain until you buffed yourself up or used Dekunda to clear those debuffs. In SMT5, however, buffs still stack, but only up to 2 times, and they incorporated the persona turn limit when it comes to buffs, where it will wear off after, I want to say, 3 turns. And so this led to fights that felt, I would say, overall less exploitable, because in previous titles, if you were up against an enemy that didn't have debuffs or Dekaja, or didn't opt to use them for whatever reason, you would just infinitely stay buffed and pretty much annihilate whatever was in front of you. Whereas in this game, you have to constantly be considering, do you want to apply 1 layer of buffs this turn and then wait until it's about to wear off to apply the second layer for more efficient turn usage? Or do you need that second layer as soon as possible because you're up against an enemy that is much stronger than you are? It helps fights not feel as predictable, but still somewhat in your control since you are able to see when buffs are going to wear off. Light and death spells now only do damage across the board unless striking a weakness, in which case there is a chance to insta-kill still, which I think is a good compromise. It allows for Hama and Mudo to be much more viable to run, but also keeps their former identity as insta-kill moves without that being the exclusive use for them. It also means that the most obvious weaknesses to cover up are light and death because of that insta-kill chance, of course. In addition to, if you have a blinking turn icon and then the next party member lands another weakness or critical hit, instead of eating up said blinking turn icon, it'll cause the next icon to blink. Outside of very niche circumstances, I don't know how much that actually functionally matters. I think the more notable change regarding this is that turn order is now determined by the actual order of your party in the menu, regardless of stats. While you don't need to pay this too much mind, because of course you can just pass turns to only give up half a turn, which is most of the time functionally the same as just having your first slot party member use an actual skill. For instance, instead of having a demon with buffs in the first slot and using that turn 1, you can simply pass to them in the second slot and have them use it at effectively the same cost. Or better yet, if your first slot party member is able to strike a weakness, then you get a little bit of damage and also only use up half a turn, passing to your second party member, which allows them to use whatever buff or healing spell or like whatever it is. Now I do forget if swapping out party members always only costed half a turn icon in previous entries. The reason why I forget is because more often than not in those games, if you are swapping in party members consistently, you're probably very much on the back foot and probably going to lose. Whereas in this game, there were actually a lot of boss fights where it was kind of necessary to swap demons in and out, less so because they were dying constantly and more so because demons were running out of MP. There was more of an incentive to have demons in reserve reserve that were actually somewhat viable instead of just having fodder in the rest of your stock outside of your core combat party. Now, there are two other notable additions to the combat in this game, being Magatsui skills and demon traits. So demon traits were not present in the original SMT V and were added in the Vengeance release, and these are essentially passive abilities that don't take up a skill slot that are largely unique to each demon. Now, of course, some of them do have the same or similar ones depending on their relation to one another. This can allow for some unique synergy beyond just magic coverage and covering your weaknesses. Something that isn't new to SMT V, but is new to me as someone who hasn't played Apocalypse, is the skill potential system, where each demon has a different skill potential for each of the different types of skills that they can learn. The higher said skill potential is, the more effective and lower cost skills in that category will be. And so this led to building demons in much more of a unique way, which I think is a positive change, because in previous titles, demons could inherit pretty much any skill through fusion. And while that may technically be true here, even though there are a lot more unique skills that can't be passed on in this game, you don't always want to pass on even some of the more powerful skills to certain demons because they might have a negative affinity towards said type of skill. Now, there were definitely instances where I just fused demons for the purpose of passing on skills, so I kind of ignored this at times, but when it came to building demons that I actually intended to use in combat, I would very much pay mind to their various skill potentials. And so, of course, in previous games, there are certain demons that did tend to lean towards being more of a healer because they had a high magic stat and maybe they naturally learned some healing skills. For those types of demons, I guess not a ton has changed here. When it comes to more offensive-oriented demons, you're not going to want to give your Jack Frost fire magic, for instance, right? Like, that's something that kind of logically makes sense, but also is reflected in Jack Frost's skill potential. It helps each demon feel a little bit more unique, in addition to being able to interact with them in the Demon Haunt, which is kind of like an optional sort of hub that allows you to talk with your demons, and at times allows them to get stat buffs from simply interacting with them. And also periodically throughout the story, you're able to gain additional skill points to invest into the protagonist, which I do think might be a little overkill, but I never felt like the Nahobino was as drastically overpowered compared to the rest of my party as I felt in SMT4, primarily because you're not given 5 stat points to choose what to do with on level up. You're given 1, although you do gain random stat buffs on level up in addition to this, so it's not quite the same as in Nocturne where you only gain that singular invested stat point. Of course, I went for a physical Murakumo build. Murakumo is an almighty physical-oriented skill. There may be some bosses that resist almighty, but I don't think I've ever seen an enemy or a boss be immune to almighty, and so you never have to worry about giving up turns by using this skill. And I think it also breaks through certain barriers and stuff like that. It's really crazy strong, and because you're limited on skill slots for so long, I think going for a physical build sort of makes sense. Or because essences are so plentiful, you can still spec into magic, but obviously you'd be changing up your skills pretty often if you did that, just depending on what boss you're going up against. I think the flexibility in the way that you can build your party in this game is a major factor as to what makes it so enjoyable, and helps it lean much more towards that sandbox design philosophy I was mentioning earlier in the exploration. I still haven't mentioned Magatsui skills, which is probably the most major addition to the combat. These feel like they're intending to serve a similar purpose to Smirk, but without being terrible. Magatsui skills basically function like limit breaks or whatever other analog in various RPGs, where you build up a meter as actions are taken, and then once that meter's full, you can do a special attack, which then depletes the meter. My main complaint when it comes to the Magatsui skills is that Omega Toki Critical is just way stronger seemingly compared to most of the other skills, or at the very least, Omega Toki Critical is so reliable throughout the entire game that I didn't even really bother to try to build parties that could take advantage of some of the more unique Magatsui skills, whereas the critical skill is always present for any demon to utilize. I'm very grateful that Omega Toki Critical exists, because without it, the hard mode health pools would have probably felt extremely spongy and annoying to deal with. They still felt spongy at times, but not unbreakable, by and large thanks to Omega Toki Critical. There are some other Magatsui skills that I did use at times, particularly ones that removed enemies' press turns whenever they were charging up their own Magatsui skill. That's another thing. The vast majority of the time when an enemy's using a Magatsui skill, it is just Omega Toki Critical, which is a little bit boring and predictable. I mean, it could definitely be devastating depending on how you built your party. I do wish that there was more variety there and more incentive to kind of experiment with different skills instead of relying on what is easily the most reliable Magatsui skill for the reasons that I mentioned. But I like the idea. I think a system like this does fit within the framework of press turn combat in a way that I do like. Despite the increased flexibility when it comes to party construction and combat execution, there was a good chunk of the game where I ended up sticking to the same strategy for most fights. So just to briefly break things down, in the early game, the boss fights in particular felt really tough due primarily to limited resources. I think one of the few times I actually grinded levels was when trying to beat Hydra. That was less a matter of increasing my stats and more so giving me access to better demons. And subsequently, there were some other early game bosses that did prove to be tricky, but but mostly in a way that I actually enjoyed and wish was kept up throughout the mid to late game. Because in the mid to late game, I pretty much stuck with a party construction of the Nahobino, of course, Idun, Hayataro, and Artemis. Idun primarily for Golden Apple, which is a recovery skill that also buffs everyone's attack, defense, and agility by one stage. Hayataro for synergy with Omagatoki Critical because of his Carnage Fang, which is a strong physical attack that does much more damage when it is a critical hit, as well as Witness Me for tanking. And then Artemis primarily because of her Somersault ability, which is a physical skill that lowers the opponent's defense by 2 stages. Now, of course, if I was up against an opponent that was immune to physical in some form or another, I would have to change things up. But in a lot of these games, it is seemingly pretty rare for enemies to be immune to physical skills specifically, as opposed to any of the other magical-oriented skills. And so this process with this party setup felt a lot like my experience with Nocturne, where I found a set of demons that worked, and they continued to work to such a degree where I kind of wish that there were more difficulty spikes to incentivize shaking up my party more often, instead of being able to rely on what turned out to be a pretty broken strat. Especially once I was able to respec my Nahobino into a physical role, it did cause a good number of bosses and mini-bosses to be charging up the Magatsubi gauge as fast as possible so that I can do a big turn of Omagatoki Critical and just chew through health bars at times with that. Now, once I got closer to more of the end game content, that's where some of the most challenging fights came up that actually warranted changing strategies. Although, because I did pay the extra $10 for the DLC, I did gain access to Konohana Sakuya, who has basically a better version of Golden Apple and also is just a higher level demon with better stats. And so that essentially just gave me a backup Idun, but better. I do feel like some of the things that I mentioned felt a little unrefined, but understandably so because they're new additions, and not so unrefined that I thought that it detracted too much from the overall combat experience either. At least the weird level scaling thing that was apparently present in the original was removed. I don't really know much about that, but from what I do know about it, I'm glad that that's not the case anymore. The punishment for being underleveled should just be the fact that you're underleveled, not an additional arbitrary handicap on top of that. And I say that especially as someone who tends to be underleveled or at least on par in a lot of RPGs. And in this particular case, even though I did damn near every subquest, I rarely ever felt like I was overleveled, in fact. I felt like it more so had to do with the way that I composed my party that caused the drop of difficulty in the mid-game especially. As far as I understand, I think there's a special harder difficulty for New Game Plus, and so that's also very enticing. Maybe that'll remedy some of my issues that I had with being able to rely on a particular strategy for so long in a series that is typically known for requiring more re-strategizing than most. Now, to briefly discuss spoilers, because there's not really a whole lot to say, I already discussed my opinions on the characters earlier, but in particular, it's mostly Ichiro Dazai that kind of rubs me the wrong way. Despite not really liking Dazai's design and thinking he was obnoxious at first glance, I think that his most redeeming quality was kind of his more genuine insecurity. I thought he was actually kind of a sweet character early on, so I was kind of willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, despite appearances. But then any and all sympathy that could be gained from those personality traits get wiped away when he turns into a complete douchebag randomly towards the end of the game, and fucking kills Yuzuru too, who actually had somewhat of a character arc going, which obviously just stops because he fucking dies in like a pretty anticlimactic fashion, I would say, especially because Ichiro and Yuzuru aren't the alignment reps for the Vengeance route, so they definitely took more of a backseat here compared to Tao and Yoko. But then it makes me wonder, why were they even as focused on as they were, which is not much. Of course, Aogami coming back is pretty stupid because they made like a big deal about him dying. That isn't something that really impacted me that hard for whatever reason in the first place. Plus, I kind of like the Tsukuyomi design for the Nahobino better. It's not really something that upsets me greatly because I didn't feel particularly invested in the story overall, especially once the Kadistu stopped being the focal point. I thought that they were the most interesting aspects to the story, and after Tiamat gets summoned, they just stop being relevant, which I thought was kind of a waste. I also think that Yoko leaving the party and then having Tao rejoin you for the final area, while that does kind of balance things out considering Yoko was around for the first area, whereas Tao wasn't. You have just Yoko at first, and then you have both of them for 2 areas, and then you have just Tao at the end. But that did kind of lead to Yoko feeling more like the villain, like a little more black and white than I feel like the alignments are usually represented. And I say that as someone who ended up getting Chaos Route. I do like that the game keeps your alignment from you until the end of the game. Obviously, some players might purposefully try to go for one or the other, but I just kind of tried to play naturally and was just curious as to what I would end up with. And I think, once again, that Yoko and Tao, as serving those extreme alignments, did a pretty decent job. For me, it's like hard to not want to side with Tao because I do feel like her heart is in more of the right place than Yoko, especially because we don't really know specifically about Yoko's past trauma or details about that, so it's kind of harder for me to sympathize with her, even though I do understand in some sense her perspective of wanting to wipe the slate clean as opposed to trying to salvage what good there might be left in the current world. But I think those kinds of quandaries are what make alignment reps interesting and compelling. It's much less about I 100% agree with this character and the other character's 100% wrong. It's more so that these alignments are intended to to be flawed in certain ways, and so it feels like much more of a tough decision. I feel like I still need to solidify my thoughts on just the overall alignment system that is present throughout the mainline series. It's not something that I've put a whole lot of thought into. Clearly that's the intent, is this focus on law versus chaos, but it's not always executed that well. I think that the way it's executed here is at least a step in the right direction. I think I liked Tao and Yoko the most when they were both in my party and conversing with one another directly. That's why I think that when Yoko leaves the party, it feels a little one-sided with Tao being around still. It would make more sense maybe if they both left at the same time, and so you are then forced to reflect on your time with each of them, or something to that effect. And then the last spoiler point that I want to mention is that I thought Tiamat would have been a perfectly fine final boss. It makes sense, I guess, to have an additional final boss depending on which alignment you pick, so I fought Mastema in this particular case, but that fight felt like it really dragged after what was a pretty grueling fight against Tiamat, to the point where once Lucifer shows up, I was just totally like over it and just wanted to be done already. I do understand why Lucifer kind of had to show up at some point, because he's a major player in this reforging of the world, so it'd be a little weird if he didn't show up at all, and this kind of would get me into the potential connections to Nocturne narratively, be it the war between heaven and hell, the Amala drums, the heavy focus on Magatsuei, and even the desert-like landscapes in the various areas of Dot. I think all of that is potential evidence towards that theory of SMT5 being a continuation of the True Demon ending of Nocturne, but it's not really something that is focused on as much as you would think, if that is the intention, or if it's simply a coincidence of the multiverse, as we see in SMT4 with the Demonicas being present, even though SMT4 does not take place in the same universe as Strange Journey, as far as I understand at least. I really like the idea that SMT5 is a continuation of Nocturne, and I think that there's enough evidence there to theorize or even headcanon your way into that line of thought, but I don't feel like the narrative here digs into that as much as I would have liked. I wouldn't be surprised, for instance, if the Demi-Fiend was going to actually have a main story focus, but due to time constraints got relegated to DLC for the base game. And I will say that getting to use Yoko's Nahobino form or whatever it was in that final fight was pretty damn cool, which is also another thing where like you get to use Tao in that kind of form throughout the entire final area, and then Yoko you only get to use in battle if you're chaos aligned and only for these fights. It's understandable to an extent, since as I mentioned way earlier, this stuff was kind of tacked onto something that was pre-existing, so I get why some of these aspects aren't as fleshed out as I think that they could be, but then that also continues to make me lament that this wasn't the basis for its own new game, instead of being tacked on to the existing SMT5. But then I guess that would have left the existing SMT5 as being underwhelming to a lot of people, so it's probably better this way overall. And overall, I did very much enjoy my time with SMT V Vengeance. It's a game that still feels like it's carrying on the legacy of the mainline series, but the appeal is a little bit different because of that shift from the more dungeon-crawling survival-oriented earlier titles towards this more flexible sandbox exploratory style. And because of a lot of the changes in this game compared to its predecessors, it has me very interested to see what SMT6 turns out to be. Of course, there is always the opportunity for remakes of some of the earlier titles that didn't make their way stateside, and that's also an opportunity for more of a return to form. Though as I mentioned earlier, I would like to see Atlas strike more of a balance between the dungeon crawling and the more open exploration if possible. Before I sign off, of course, I want to thank my channel members and shout out the Space Cowboy at the Super Shadow Operative tier. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, of course, if you enjoyed, and I will catch you guys in the next video.